Here is what makes up a thesis project or dissertation, if you want to use that particular term. You're allowed to use that as well, I suppose. Typically is built around 6 chapters. Chapter 1 is just a simple introduction. We'll show you the contents of that in just a moment. And then there's a chapter on biblical and theological foundations. There is a literature review. Biblical and theological foundations is the theology in the Bible. What does the Bible or theology say about this topic that I'm addressing? Specifically, death rituals and bereavement, death rituals and mourning. What does the Bible say about that? We'll show you that in just a moment. Then a literature review. What is contemporary research saying about contemporary bereavement leadership and how people mourn and how they grieve? Chapter 4, the methodology for the study. Okay, I need to find an answer to this problem in ministry. How am I going to go about finding that answer? So I write all those details in chapter 4. And quite detailed there. Chapter 5, here's the results. Here's what I learned. And here's the end result of my research. Chapter 6, just a summary of the first 5 chapters. So that's essentially what goes into the thesis project. Chapter 1, as I said, is an introduction to the study, and I start out with the rationale for the study. Why am I writing this? Why does this matter to me? So the bereaved today want to mourn their loss through personalized death rituals that reflect their own beliefs and values. This is true not only for the unchurched, it's true for people in your congregations. They want it to be personal. They don't want it to be liturgical. I'll show you why in just a moment. But you need to spend time, you get to spend time with families co-creating services that you will be leading for your own church family or friends and family of those within your ministry, whatever it might be. You want something personalized. That's the way our world is. Your phone, your computer screens, your wardrobe, your house, your car, whatever, it's custom, right? Whatever you own, nobody owns anything quite like it. And that's just our mindset. Same is going to be true pretty much with the way that you say goodbye and we say goodbye to you. Any kind of liturgical or formulaic traditions are foreign to our Pacific Northwest culture. And I've got some friends watching on Zoom that are in the Bible Belt, and they're still very traditional, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a cultural difference. But here in the Pacific Northwest, we are an anomaly. We are just a different animal completely. Think about this, just a little sidebar here. Seattle is on the cutting edge of culture. We introduced the world to Starbucks, Microsoft, Amazon, Boeing, UPS, Nordstrom. What else comes out of the Pacific?
Pickleball.
Costco, pickleball?
Yeah, it was born in Bainbridge Island.
Oh, I didn't even know that. Okay.
What about Google?
Google, I think, is down in California. We were the first to legalize marijuana. We were the first to legalize gay marriage. So here's the thing. The world wants to be like Seattle. Seattle is completely different. And terramation, okay, natural organic reduction. We are in a facility right here where they conduct human composting. And the very first, it's another form of what we call accelerated reduction, or the body decaying. Your body's going to decay anyway. And Micah will give us a tour, if you're interested when we're finished, how they do that naturally, organically here. The very first natural organic reduction facility in the world was just right up the street in Kent. This one is the largest and most advanced on the planet, in the world. Now these folks here are on the bleeding edge, and they're from Seattle, right? So the whole world wants to be like the Northwest. Listen, we need to understand our culture. And here, for me personally, I really want Seattle to be like Jesus. And there's a lot of people that agree with me on that. If that's going to happen, I don't know. We'll see. I'm trying. But the idea that something liturgical or formulaic just doesn't work in the Pacific Northwest. It can work in your church, but your church members would prefer to have something customized. And that can happen. And here's a point that I wanted to make. Christians who prefer contemporary ministry methodologies. Probably most of the people in your congregations want contemporary worship style, contemporary music, some traditional, which is fine, some hymns, which is fine. They prefer generally contemporary Bible translations. They enjoy technology. If you got a video projector, if you got an app, if you got, computers or tablets or whatever you're using, that's technology that your congregation has become used to. Those are contemporary ministry methodologies. They also want the same for funerals. There's a disconnect if we step back 80, 100, 200, 300 years when it comes time for a funeral. And I'm not saying that we can lose any of the spiritual dimension and the spiritual impact of a funeral, but it depends a lot on how it's presented and how it's put together. So, all right, pastors who do not understand what contemporary society thinks, feels, and behaves, even in your congregations, about loss, are limited in their ability to communicate timeless truth that can bring comfort, blessing, and healing to those who mourn. You've all heard people speak, whether at a church or on a political campaign or on a television or whatever, or in a classroom where the presenter, is just out of touch with reality, out of touch with culture, out of touch with where people are today. And we have a tendency to discount what is being said. If we don't understand how to communicate in a culturally relevant way, the same thing we would say 100 years ago, we're missing an opportunity to have a deep impact. All right. So here's how this problem in ministry is a little bit more specifically defined. The complexity of the grief process is underestimated. We have a tendency to think that, you'll get over it, you just snap out of it, you just move on. Jesus loves you, he takes care of you, the person's in heaven, you're going to be fine, no more pain, no more sorrow, move on. It's not how grief works. Grief is long and it's messy and it's unpredictable and it's complicated. And I want to show you a model for helping people navigate where they are and the okayness of being confused in grief. Traditional funeral methodologies are culturally irrelevant. I touched on that just a moment ago. It's part of the reason why this study needed to take place. Practical training resources are lacking. In my research, I read, I don't know how many books I read. I got stacks and stacks. Joanne and Leroy was talking about just a moment ago how long and arduous and difficult and challenging it is to write the dissertation. Joanne can attest to that. And I can as well. Up at 6 in the morning, down at 9 at night. My original schedule was 9, 5 days a week, but that's never going to happen. But anyway, I put in, I don't even know how many hundreds and hundreds of hours, but I got it done. And in part of my research, I bought every book printed in the last 10 years for pastors on how to lead funerals. And without exception, the emphasis was on preaching the funeral. Preaching the funeral. It's a preaching event. Not in the Northwest, it isn't. That is a big, big cultural disconnect. We're different out here. So I think more culturally relevant packaging and presentation of the same ministry skills and content can be helpful. All right, the problem of ministry defined. Pastors need a way to understand and contextualize, make it relevant or relatable to the culture in which you live, the grief process, before they can effectively lead those who are grieving. You need to understand at least a little bit about how people here, especially in the Northwest, grieve and mourn so we can minister to them more effectively. So I have a couple of books here that were foundational to my work. The first one is called Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy, written by William Worden. He's a professor, retired now, professor at Rosemead School of Psychology at Biola University and at Harvard. So he teaches at a couple of very solid schools. And in his work, he talks about the 4 tasks of mourning. Kubler-Ross talked about stages of grief, right? And you're familiar with those. Here's the thing about Kubler-Ross and her work. She did not write about those who were grieving because a loved one had died. Do you know what the focus of her work was? People who were dying and grieving because they are dying. People, they're still alive, but coming to the end of the trail, and they know it, and they're working through that emotionally and relationally. That's what she wrote about. But people say it is about, okay, you know, a loved one died, now I'm grieving. That's not what she wrote about. So what Worden wrote about is, when a loved one dies, what do you experience emotionally, relationally, cognitively, spiritually? These kinds of dimensions to every person's life. And he said there are tasks that must be completed in order to process grief in a healthy way. This is what we need to know about. The Kubler-Ross model is helpful in some ways, but not for the kind of grief and mourning that we're talking about. Four tasks: to accept the reality of the loss, to process the pain of grief, to adjust to a world without the deceased, and to remember the deceased. If people can learn to complete these tasks, they will be able to move forward in their pain and in their loss in a healthy way. And I'll show you in this model, there's 20 ways to do that. It's amazing. So that brings us to this second book here, Do Funerals Matter, written by Bill Hoy, who is at, he's down in Waco at Baylor University. And in his work, he looked at how people manage their pain. What are the death rituals or behaviors related to loss? And a ritual is what you do to try to cope with your pain. It's a behavior you try to do, something you do to try to cope with your loss. He looked at global cultures all across the world, all across history, from biblical times to modern times, in advanced cultures, third world cultures. And there, of course, there are going to be unlimited numbers of rituals, but he boiled it down to essentially to 5 general categories: significant symbols, gathered community. Everybody, for all of humanity and all of time and every culture, needs these things to process their pain. Ritual action, cultural heritage. What is it unique about our culture, in the way that we grieve as a people? And it's different around the world. It's different here in the Northwest. And then fifthly, number 5, the body's presence. What do we do with the body here in the Northwest that people don't do in the South, or in Africa, or in the Soviet Union, whatever it might be? Every culture is a little bit different. And so Hoy touches on this. So in my general readings, I'm getting started trying to figure out where do I want to go with my research. I read Worden's book and I read Hoy's book, and I thought, has anybody ever synthesized these two models together? Because Worden is saying, here's what needs to be done. Hoy is saying, this is what people do. And I looked and looked and looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find anything to synthesize these two. So I got a hold of Leroy and I said, can I go this direction? And he said, go in that direction. He didn't tell me just to go. He just told me to go in this direction. So you have there for you, right, Leroy? You have there, I think that was that one conversation. Okay. You have there the handout, the sheet that I gave to you, with 2 of these matrices. The matrix on top, matrix on the bottom. And across the top, you can see the 4 tasks of mourning. Then across the column on the left, you can see the 5 death rituals. And what I'm looking at is, what does it look like when these 2 models intersect? You tracking with me on that? All right. So here's my definition. We're going to dive into that in just a moment. Here's my definition of the contemporary grief process. It's the full constellation, how do you like that word? full constellation of bereavement experiences identified within the intersecting relationships among William Worden's 4 tasks of mourning and William Hoy's 5 death rituals. In other words, well, let me just go this way, I'll show it here. The contemporary grief process looks like anything that you come up with when any one of Worden's tasks intersect with Hoy's rituals. And there's 4 across the top, 5 across the bottom, there's 20 boxes. And my task now that I've got this basic framework established is to go to the scriptures, go to theology, and is there anything that can illustrate what each one of these intersections looks like? That's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is to get out there and look at the research that has already been conducted, the contemporary research, findings of other thanatologists, which are death specialists, pastors, leaders, funeral directors, etc., and look at contemporary research regarding contemporary bereavement, and can they illustrate what it looks like when any one of these 4 points intersects any one of these 5 points. You tracking with me on that? Okay, good. So, regarding chapter 2, if a Worden-Hoy synthesis, bringing them together, is a workable paradigm or a way of viewing things, illustrations of what each task or ritual intersection looks like will most likely be found in the scriptures. In other words, if this is legit, if these 2 models can be intersected, and it's true that it's the way that people grieve and mourn, we should be able to find examples in the scriptures. I was overwhelmed with what I found in the Bible. I was shocked. And I see more and more and more and more. It's just like once it gets up on your radar screen a little bit, you begin to see things more and more and more. I think it's with your reticular activation system or something like that. I recently bought a Subaru Ascent. I had not seen too many on the road until I bought mine, and then every other car is a Subaru Ascent. You ever notice that? Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. All right. So you have in your first chart that I gave to you, this is the biblical and theological illustrations of what these intersections look like. I had to be very selective. There is so much in the scriptures. I was just really surprised. So what I'm going to do is just walk through the first row. Let's give you 2 examples for the first intersection, 1 example for the next, and lights are going to turn on. I think this is fascinating. Bill Worden's first task of mourning is to accept the reality of the loss. You need to say, yes, this person died. And to show biblical examples, we're going to use a symbol to help people accomplish that task. Also a symbol to help people accomplish the task of processing the pain of grief. How did people in the Bible do this? How did they learn to adjust to a world without the deceased through the use of symbols? And how did they remember the deceased through the use of symbols? It's all over the place. Here's an example. David killed Goliath, right? All right. Notice what he did. He killed him with a stone, cut off the head of the giant, and then 1 Sam 17:54, David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. Why? To help the people in Jerusalem accept the reality of the Philistines' loss, actually, but to prove to Jerusalem, this guy is no longer a threat to us, and here is what symbolizes our peace. And to help Jerusalem accept the reality, actually, of their gain. And Goliath's head functioned as a symbol to help people accept the reality of that death. Here's another verse related to the same killing of Goliath. David returned from killing the Philistine, and Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. It's kind of gruesome, but why? Why did he do it? He wanted King Saul to know for sure Goliath is no longer a threat, and he used a symbol to communicate that. All right. Processing the pain of grief. Early in the church, in the book of Acts, there was a lady named Dorcas, or what, Tabitha? Yeah, I like Tabitha better than Dorcas. Yeah. She died. They brought Peter to the house. Notice this. When Peter arrived, they, the women that knew Dorcas, brought him into the room upstairs, and all the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing all the tunics and garments that Dorcas used to make while she was with them. What's happening here? These garments that this lady sewed had become symbols, and as they are showing these symbols, putting these symbols on display, they're processing the pain of their loss. Just look behind you and see the photographs. That's no different. Those photographs are symbols of loss. The symbols of a relationship. They're reminders, they're remembrances. And as people come here to this place to sit in a chair and look at the photographs, they're processing the pain and the grief. That's why this place has been set up this way. More about that during the tour. Now, to adjust to a world without the deceased. Using symbols, I think this is absolutely fascinating. Check this out. After Aaron's going to die and Moses is going to die. Aaron died first. Moses is next. After Moses stripped Aaron of his garments, Aaron was the high priest, and put them on Aaron's son Eleazar. Aaron died there on the mountaintop. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. Notice this. When all the congregation, check this out, saw that Aaron had died, the whole house of Israel wept for Aaron for 30 days. They are adjusting to their world, to a new high priest, new leadership. But how did they know that Aaron had died? What symbol demonstrated that their high priest is dead? The high priest's son is wearing his dad's clothes. They took the priestly garments off of Aaron. They put it on Eleazar. Eleazar came into the camp wearing the garments of the high priest. And the congregation saw symbolically, they didn't watch Aaron die, but the clothing sent that message: your high priest is dead. This is your new high priest. And they took 30 days, they set aside 30 days to adjust to a different world with a different spiritual leader. So there's an example of what that intersection looks like. Finally, to remember the deceased is one of these 4 universal tasks of mourning. Absalom was King David's son who tried to take the throne from him. But here's a little episode about Absalom. In his lifetime, he had taken and set up for himself a memorial stone, which is in the King's Valley, for he said, I have no son to continue my name. So he named the memorial stone after his own name, and it is called Absalom's Monument to this day. What's happening? Typically, a person's name is carried on from generation to generation to generation through the sons, through their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Absalom didn't have any children, and he was afraid that people were going to not remember him. See the fourth task, to remember the deceased? He wants to be remembered. So he built a monument with his name on it, so people would see the monument. That's a symbol. He created his own symbol so that he would not be forgotten and people would remember the deceased. You see how that works? So you can go through, as I did, all 20 boxes and complete every one of these boxes with multiple examples or illustrations of these 4 tasks of mourning in these 5 death rituals, cover to cover in the scriptures. All right, let's take a look at chapter 3 and the literature review, and then I think we're going to take a little break and answer some questions. For chapter 3, if a Warden-Hoy synthesis is a workable paradigm, illustrations of what each task or ritual intersection looks like will most likely be found in the research literature related to the contemporary grief process. So we're on track. We know what that's all about. You have that second diagram, that second matrix. And it's different than the biblical and theological one, because this is coming from contemporary research in the last 10 years. This is what researchers are finding about what it looks like when wardens, not specifically, they didn't specifically address these intersections, but in other comments they made, it's very clear when we have this kind of framework for viewing it, that they are addressing these topics. Let me give you an example here. For significant symbols and to accept the reality of loss, look at this. Seeing the body challenges the natural wish to avoid the reality of death, which is unhealthy. We need to accept the reality of death. And how do we do that? You need to see the body, if you can. While at the same time encouraging healthy acceptance of the death. So it's written by a man named Alan Wolfelt, and the book he wrote, Death in Grief, A Guide to Clergy. So do you see how those two have come together, and this is what research and experts are writing? Significant symbols, another symbol to help process the pain of grief is this. Bill Hoy wrote this in his funeral book. From the beginning of time, symbols have played a vital role in the human attempt to make meaning of experiences. We're not trying to make meaning of the life, but we're trying to make meaning of the loss. And we're asking questions. Did this life matter? And what do I do now? What does this mean about me and who I am and my redefined relationship that I'm forced to have to work through? And I have to process all of this and adjust to all of this, which is the next point as well. But symbols help people move forward in that. And Hoy talks about that quite a bit, as other researchers do. To adjust to a world without the deceased, these researchers show that confirmation of a reasonably satisfactory level of adjustment to loss is usually provided when the bereaved can part with the possessions of the deceased, clearing out a clothes closet, sending all those shoes off to Goodwill, maybe giving the tools to a neighbor or to grandkids or something else. What used to belong to the deceased, it can be extremely difficult to let that go. If you've ever watched Hoarders, and you watch that show, Why People Hoard, if not always, it is often, if not usually, associated with grief. Just listen next time you watch that show. Listen to the pain, listen to the loss, listen to the grief. And healthy adjustment is knowing how to distribute or to let go of those possessions that belong to someone else. You want to keep some, that's fine, but not everything. Finally, to remember the deceased through personalized mementos, little souvenirs or takeaways. Souvenirs are evidence of the relationship between the bereaved and the deceased and assert the right of the bereaved to grieve. Did a service one time and the guy collected Matchbox cars and they were all in the original packages. He had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And the family said, take one home. And these belonged to this guy and he would want you to have one. So there's a little souvenir, a little memento, those kinds of things where we just have something visually to look at. And there's all sorts of creative ideas that are going on out there. And so there is plenty of modern research that illustrates what each one of these intersecting points looks like. And I've just given you a brief quote for that top line. So let me just summarize quickly what I learned through these two syntheses, and then we'll take a little break and actually get up and get some coffee, use the restrooms, drink some orange juice, whatever it might be, because we're going to be beyond the halfway point at this point. So here's some things that I learned. Illustrations of a Worden-Hoy synthesis were found in the biblical and theological resources related to the grief process. Okay, that makes sense. Illustrations of a Worden-Hoy synthesis were also found in the literature related to the contemporary grief process. So not only Bible and theology, but secular research as well. It's out there, validating the intersection of these two models. Okay, questions, comments, need for clarification, and then we're going to get up and stretch, walk a little bit. We'll point you to the restrooms and get something to drink. Questions, comments, need for clarification from anybody? Yes?
I was thinking about when my father died and my sister was here, and we quickly remove my grandfather's things from his or my grandmother's bedroom. And I have always thought, did we do that too quickly? So my question is there a time element involved in, for example, that one, removing their,
17.3 days.
oh, is that, are you serious?
It's my mom, okay? It's my mom. I can do that. So I waited, what, 64 years to do that? No. Here's the thing about grief and mourning. There is no formula. There is no time schedule. There is no timetable. People do what they believe at the moment is the best thing to do. And they can often look back and go, oh, that was premature. Or I waited way too long. There's going to be these questions. There's going to be these doubts. You're going to be wrestling with that. Welcome to grief. It is messy. It is unpredictable. And just about the time you think you got it, man, you get hit with a tidal wave. And it's just like, where did that come from? And so I'm going to say that you're questioning the timing on that is normal. Katie, can you validate anything related to that?
Why you get that response? Are you, so for example, my nana, she wanted my grandpa's stuff out of the house immediately. And for her, that was, I want it gone, I don't want to think about it. It wasn't, I'm ready to move on.
Yeah.
So I think if you think about, if you can take a step back, take a breath, and think about why you're doing something before you do it, it's helpful. But your experience is normal for most people. Most people do it fairly.
Yeah, good. Let me summarize what Katie said. Katie's a funeral director here. She said that a key element in this whole issue of timing on removing, let me go back and summarize what you said as well, Mom, because I don't know if the people on Zoom heard it. When Grandpa died, when your dad died, you and Aunt Kathy wanted to move Grandpa's things out of the bedroom as soon as possible. And your question was, did we do that too soon? Should we left things in the bedroom for just a little bit? And so you heard my response to that. And then I asked Katie to contribute to the conversation here. And Katie's point is, why were things moved out quickly? And when your Nana died, they wanted things out of that room like immediately. And the question is why? Why do you want things removed so quickly? Everybody has their own reasons. And at the time, it just seems like it's the right thing to do for whatever reason that is. Here's something that, and it's just like a bonus. People are going to do things that you don't understand. It's not going to make any sense to you, but it's their decision to make. And if you can support them in that process, talk them through it, try to guide them through it, try to help them see objectively what they're thinking about doing, especially major decisions like selling a house and buying a boat or whatever. Slow down, getting married, slow down. Let's wait till after the funeral, something. I tell Joanne it might, never mind, I'm not going to say that. Because I want there to be another anniversary. Okay, so thank you, Katie, for that. John?
Something else that you didn't touch on a lot, except for just the presence of Goliath and David.
Yes.
Displaying the body. Something that happened with my daughter 2 years ago when her grandmother, mom's side of the family, her mom's side of the family, when she died, they let her lay in the bed in the house.
Okay.
For a day.
Yeah.
And the whole family came over and everybody spent their time. I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
That my daughter held her hands, looked in her mouth, physically touched her, and just sat there with the dead body.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Yeah, so John is talking, for those of you on Zoom, I don't know if you heard, but John's talking about his daughter's grandmother who died. And they let the grandmother lay in the bed there for the next 2 days, and John's daughter, Lily, would get in bed with the grandmother and hold her hand and look in her mouth and just explore. And that's the body's presence. That's the fifth ritual that Hoy writes about. What you do with the body is huge. It's huge. And the decisions for the process here is a major decision. The decision about final disposition of the body is major. Not everybody's going to agree with what they do here at Return Home. Not everybody's going to agree with embalming and putting a casket in the ground. Everybody is a little bit different, and we need to give the people the space to do that. And if you have theological convictions about that, those of us who are pastors, be informed enough to talk with people in your congregation about this. I was at a pastor's conference in Yakima a couple of weeks ago. Chris was there, and I had mentioned about different options for cremation, different kinds of cremation and casketed burials and so forth. Listen, if you don't know these options, your congregation does, and they want to be able to talk about these with you because they read about it, they hear about it, they talk to people. It's out there, people know about it. It's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you here to see and to learn more about this process. Okay, so the body's presence. In fact, it used to be back in the time awake. This was before medical technology had advanced. They would keep the body present to see if it would wake, if it would wake up, and if it didn't, then it was time for the burial. But there's a lot of interaction, at that time as well when the body is present in those final days or final moments. Okay, anybody on Zoom? Any questions? Or Jeff, I see your.
I got two.
Two.
Number one would be,
Bring
as a
it.
pastor,
Yeah.
you would know this better than I, in working with funeral homes.
Yes.
Over the last 25 years, noticing that it went from every funeral director having a faith background
Yes.
in their assistants to now virtually none.
Okay.
So how does that impact what you're sharing?
Okay. So Jeff's question is, over the years, Jeff's observation, and he's asking think a little bit for some validation on that, and also my response to it, is it used to be that primarily those who were funeral directors were people of faith. And now Jeff's observation, mine as well, is that fewer and fewer and fewer funeral directors are people of faith who would call themselves a Christian or evangelical, even if you want to get into that kind of a niche or whatever it might be. And how does that influence
Your thesis and what you're talking about.
Yeah.
How funerals are conducted.
how funerals are conducted? I didn't really get into that so much in my thesis writing, but practically day to day when I'm doing services, it's not about the funeral director. It's about the family. And good funeral directors who get it, who want their businesses to thrive, will serve the needs of their clientele. And that's why they want pastors or they want leaders who know what to do, because when we're leading a service, we become the face of that business. And we either make that funeral home look good or look bad, and every person sitting in the audience is a future client. And if I get up there and I blow it because I'm culturally irrelevant, every person sitting in the room might be thinking, I'm not coming here for my funeral. I'm going somewhere else. So they're leaning toward people who have been trained to do celebrations of life and other kinds of services related. And then let's hear from the funeral director.
What you're talking about, a pastor standing up at the front and doing a bad job, is how my business goes to pot. Because every single person in that audience will say, just cremate me. I don't want that.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of pastor is more of a detriment to the taking place of a funeral than a funeral director with or without their
Right.
own faith.
Yeah.
Because a good funeral director knows that there's nothing to do with them. Their faith has no play in this.
Right.
But having gone to a bad funeral, having a bad experience with a funeral is the leading cause of the next generation not wanting to have a funeral.
Yeah, so let me just summarize what Katie is saying here. She's a funeral director, and she's saying when a pastor leads a service and does a poor job, that's killing her business, because people in the audience are going, I don't want that. Just cremate me and we're done. It's over. I don't want a service.
Especially for this experimental kind of business.
Yes. Okay, anybody out there? Yes, I'm listening. Yeah, let me summarize for those of you who are here. I'm hearing voices. I'm going to tell you what my voices are telling me. No, I was Leroy Gertzen, Dr. Gertzen. He was saying that just in the last 40, 45 years, and I'm going to summarize here, of course, the role of the pastor in the community's appreciation and respect for pastoral leadership and the clergy has significantly declined. We are viewed completely differently than we were 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so we step up in front of an audience and we're going to be leading, an event that's very important to the family at this time. We start, I'm going to add a little bit to what Leroy said, we start with zero respect. We start with zero spiritual authority in their lives. And for us to speak into their lives, spiritual truth, needs to be earned. And I've discovered some ways that that works very effectively. It's not a part of what we're going to talk about today. But I think Leroy brings up an excellent point that just culturally, just looking at the big picture outside of this room, outside of our own facilities where we minister, the community and the culture does not view us, guys, the way that they used to view your dad and others, okay? So that's why I'm a big advocate for being out in the community and getting to know people, you know, outside the four walls of your building. That can bring a lot of credibility to your ministry in that way. How'd I do, Leroy? Okay, he said it was lousy, and he couldn't believe I said that, but no, he said it. He said I got it. He said I got it. Good. Thanks, Leroy. Good. Somebody else? Dennis?
I was just wondering if you had a printout of all the corresponding scripture that goes with this top chart.
Right there. If you want the chapter, I'll give you the chapter. I'll get a copy of the chapter to you. Can I do that, Leroy? Is that legit? Okay. I own the copyright on it, so I guess it's okay. John?
Mine's just a curiosity question.
Yeah,
Have
sure.
you shared these results with Hoy or Warden?
Warden is retired, and I don't have an email address for him. I know he's retired down at Laguna Beach, I think is where he is. Maybe I should stop by and visit him.
Yeah.
And I stopped by Baylor University about 4 or 5 weeks ago to visit Bill Hoy, but he was out of the office doing a funeral. So, you know, and Leroy Matias was going to join us today too, and he's doing a funeral today. So I have not. I've written to them, but have not received a response. So, but I would love to, and I'm going to quote, I quoted Candy Can. Did I quote her? I think, yeah, souvenirs, evidence. She's at Baylor also. She's down there. So, but I've not met these men. I'd love to meet them. They've deeply impacted, you know, my view and my leadership. And I've corresponded with Bill Hoy. I stopped by his office right next to the Starbucks on campus, which is really super convenient. Yeah. But next time I'm in Waco, we'll get together and spend some time. Good question. Anybody else? Okay, let's take 5.